Today I've got a special bike here. This is a 2007 Iron Horse Sunday, and in this video I'm going to be talking about what it's like to ride and race a bike that's almost 20 years old with 26-inch wheels. Let's get into it. So a little backstory on the bike. For those of you who don't know, this is an iconic downhill bike, mainly because it's synonymous with Sam Hill's utter domination of the downhill scene in the late 2000s. This bike was definitely a major step forward in downhill bike technology at the time. So being a downhill fan, when this bike popped up on Craigslist for like $300, I couldn't say no. And I've been riding this bike for about 6 years now. I've spent a good amount of time on it, and most recently I raced it at the Northwest Cup in Port Angeles in the pro category. Didn't do too bad on it. And yeah, I think it's just really fun to kind of go back and ride this bike and see how it holds up. You have to ride it differently, and I think the ceiling of this bike is definitely a lot lower than the modern bikes out there right now, but it's impressive what you can do on this bike and how well it performs. So I think a good place to start is with the geo and the sizing, because honestly, like, the construction and the suspension of the frame is honestly super impressive for 2007. It doesn't look out of place in the modern crop of bikes, besides the fact that it just looks incredibly tiny. And it is. So this is a size medium. It's the 17-inch frame. I'm 6'1", so even the large would have been small, but the medium is kind of extra tiny. It doesn't have a reach number, just a top tube number, but I would imagine it's in the 400 mil range, maybe shorter. It's a 65-degree head angle and a 438 mil chainstay. The wheelbase is like 1150, and modern downhill bikes are easily into the 1300 range. So it's just a massive difference in sizing. And honestly, that's the biggest thing I have to manage on this bike. I'll get into the suspension details later, but it honestly performs incredibly well. It's a little different than the modern crop of bikes, but the suspension doesn't really hold this bike back at a certain point. It's what I really have to manage is the sizing, and the fact that it has 26-inch wheels. That's definitely a factor too. But what I notice is I really have to be mindful of keeping my body centered on the bike. With longer reaches, slacker head angles, bigger wheels, it's the feeling that I get is I'm much more centered in between the wheels. And if I make a mistake and get a little thrown forward, I'm not going to get pitched over the bars. And same thing, I just have a lot more space behind me to hold me from falling off the back of the bike. And I think a large part of that is riding bigger wheels as well. With this bike, you can so easily get thrown over the front, and then there's just nothing there to catch you. So it's that tipping point is much closer to where you actually ride the bike. And then going the other way with getting further back on the bike, that's probably the biggest adjustment I had to make. When I first got on this thing again, I went to preload off a lip and bunny hop, and I just fully looped out. You really have to be mindful with not being too far over the back, especially when preloading the bike and stuff, because it can just fully get away from you. On modern downhill bikes and enduro bikes, sometimes it takes a really kind of aggressive load with the bike to get the front wheel up. With this, you just think about it and lean back and the front wheel's up. So it's you really have to hold yourself forward on the bike, but you can't be too forward, or else you're going to be going over the bars. The head angle's not that slack. So it just makes it a bit more of a precise dance with where you're holding your weight. And when you get it right, it rides really well, but it makes me just a little bit more apprehensive with my riding, because if something happens and something doesn't go to plan, I can so easily get really out of shape on it. But it also means that I can throw it around in really fun ways too. Generally, it's a feeling of being a little bit more on top of the bike and less in the bike. Bikes are so big these days that you can really sit in them, whereas this one, you're kind of on top of it. And if you look at my riding, I look kind of stiff on it. And it's just because I don't have that confidence to really let myself relax and like move around on it. And definitely hitting jumps on this thing is a bit of a dicey proposition, just because I feel like if I get my weight just slightly wrong, I can either be like skywheeling like off the back or getting bucked weird. It's really kind of difficult to time when jumping this bike. Moving on to the suspension, it's honestly super impressive. I would say the biggest difference between this and modern bikes is, I don't know this for sure, but with this bike, it feels like there just isn't the level of progression that has kind of come around in the past 20 years, and it just feels really, really linear. That's kind of a trade-off. It feels really, really good in some situations, but then when it comes to hitting bigger compressions and really kind of running into things hard when you're pushing the pace, like at the race, I just felt like there was a certain level of like, I'm not willing to go hit this hole as hard as I can because the suspension isn't going to have that hold up, and then if I get thrown forward, the geometry isn't going to take care of me. So I think, in all out like speed, rough, and big compressions, the threshold is lower, but where this bike excels is in like the fluttery stuff and like keeping the wheel on the ground and holding traction. It's actually incredible like how well the suspension performs, and like on more technical things, like where you're holding traction, it's slower, a little bit more involved. Like it's really easy to place this bike, and like, I don't know, flat corners, it not only does it feel like it has good grip and balance in a certain sense, but it just feels like the wheels are like really tracking. Like having coil front and rear, I don't know, like the suspension setup is like generally kind of soft and like lacks that like upper level of support, but the traction and feel I was getting from it, especially at the race, was like really impressive. And I was able to like hook some sick inside lines, doing it for Sam Hill, like have to do it on the Sunday, but it's also the fact that this bike does that really well. And being that like downhill tracks were a little bit more technical back in the day, I could see this bike performing really well. And I think, maybe going to a slightly stiffer spring or like building, a bit more support into the suspension, there would be ways to do that. Like I kind of understand that it has some limitations, but like it performs incredibly well. I think it performs really well under braking. The level of feedback I'm getting through my feet is fairly low, and it just feels like really balanced. And then maybe the next thing to touch on is just the construction of the frame. You saw in this era, there were some like kind of sketchy designs and, stuff that didn't look good, but this is a sexy looking bike. And, someone asked me if I was like worried about the integrity of the frame. And it's just like, I don't know. Look at it. Like, look at these welds. Look at that gusset from like the down tube to the top tube. Like all these welds are so sick. Like they're honestly some of the best welds I've ever seen on a bike. I've got faith in this thing. Feels like fairly stiff and solid, and I don't know, it's just, the build quality is not something I'm worried about, and the fact that it's held up for 20 years, being ridden quite a bit, is a testament to that. The only thing is that this lower link does develop play. It's a known issue, and it's really hard to get around. So this bike does have a little bit of play in it, but it's kind of comes with the territory of owning a 20-year-old bike, and once you get it galloping down into the rough stuff, it's kind of hard to notice. This shock has surprisingly held up for this long. It's a little cavitated and it makes some noise right when you're warming it up, but once it gets warm, it honestly feels really good. Maybe that's where a bit of the lack of support is coming from, but that old DHX 5.0 is still holding strong. Broadly speaking, like I have a ton of fun riding this thing. I did a back-to-back lap on a modern downhill bike. I got the chance to ride at M1, and obviously like the threshold of that bike is so insanely high. I felt so confident on it, and I expected going back to this to be a lot worse, but I was surprised. I was like, okay, like it's actually not as big of a difference as I thought. I'm still able to ride this at a pretty high level, and I have a ton of fun riding this thing. So it's like, really, what are you trying to get out of it? I guess if you're not like super plugged in, like this bike is going to be maybe a little bit more dicey to ride, but if you're able to operate within its limits and kind of sign up for what this thing's going to give you, like you could probably pick one of these things up for like 800 bucks, put a little money into it, and like have a great time on a downhill bike. You know, I guess it's worth talking about 26-inch wheels. Like they're definitely smaller. There's definitely not as much traction, not as much of a contact patch. They don't run over stuff as good, but you know, you got 200 mils of travel to help you out with that. And the bike comes alive in the tight stuff. So I don't know, it's like, yeah, it's not gonna be the fastest, sickest bike out there, but it still provides like a really high quality ride experience. And, you know, thinking back to what, you know, Sam Hill was doing back in the day, I think he even had custom geometry. I think he had the medium seat tube with the large top and down tube. So he had the lower standover height with a bit of a longer reach and a slacker head angle. And like, I think about that bike with a little bit more room, a little bit slacker head angle, and probably like he was doing some cool stuff to the suspension. Like, I mean, that bike had to be insane. Besides the 26-inch wheels, probably not too far off from like what downhill bikes are, you know, doing these days. I feel like this bike was way ahead of its time, and, you know, riding it in 2024, I'm not bummed on it, you know. Got the old high roller here, you know, had to do it, the old DHF old school high roller combo. Let me know if you guys have any questions on this bike. Yeah, are you guys still riding old beater rigs? Like, it's kind of fun to just turn your brain off. You know, it's easy to be so plugged into bike setup and nerding these days. You know, I'm definitely in that camp where, you know, little setup things kind of bother me. I can get in that mode, but it's kind of fun to just get on something completely different that's way outdated, and just turn your brain off and go ride it. I feel like I'm either in one of those two camps where I'm like really paying attention to my setup, or it's just like fully turn it off, ride the bike, deal with what you got. And this bike kind of gets me there while still like providing like a really, honestly, high level of performance for what it is. So hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you got any questions on this thing, and I'll see you guys in the next one.